When my family moved from River City to Eden City, I think the biggest change was not the river itself, but the people in Eden City. River City was a serious place, but the entire economy was geared both towards the river and the tourism industry. Candy shops, clothes shops, toy shops, and numerous other shops existed, regardless of the district or neighborhood you existed in. Hell, across from the governor's office was a candy shop that was only open during work hours during the week to exclusively cater to government employees. Eden City was not like this at all. The first thing I noticed in Eden City was how sharp the differences were between districts. When we passed through the Iron District, it had no sidewalks and cracks in the asphalt as we drove through it, and I saw all the factories that were packed back to back. No storefronts, and every factory had a razor wire fence and armed security guards by the entrance, checking everyone who came in. It almost felt like a war zone, though I didn't know why a steel mill or a computer chip factory had security that put the River City governor's mansion to shame. And then, just 2 blocks later, when we arrived in the Pearl District, suddenly there were sidewalks and storefronts. Though there was still a lot of security at just about every storefront. Standing in front of all the doors was at least one guard, and I could count at least one pistol. I guess every business in Pearl District required a bouncer. But as we traveled through the Pearl District, we finally made it to the gates of the Garden District. The wall that separated the Garden and Pearl Districts stood at least 20 meters tall, and I could count no less than 4 machine gun nests, 2 next to the road and 2 on the wall above. I felt cold sweat drip down my neck as my father went on and on about the local history of Eden City. The city has 3 separate economic districts, and the Garden District is for the best of the best. Security is so high because Eden City is so close to the kingdom of Vespucci. The Vigiles have kept any attack from occurring in the Iron District, but security is heightened across the city due to attacks in the Iron and the Pearl Districts. The Iron District produces the majority of material in the 7 cities, and Pearl is where most of the shopping occurs in the city. Luckily, my work is taking us into the Garden District, where all the best tech companies exist in the 7 cities. We aren't just going to be the cutting edge, we are going to be the bleeding edge. And this has been such a wonderful opportunity after that incident, he said, referring to the divorce with my mother. I wish I could say it was a complicated incident, but honestly, she wasn't good for him, and she wasn't good for me, and quite honestly, she wasn't good for herself either. When the divorce settlement came through, the only thing she fought against was visitation hours. She didn't want me living or visiting her at all. So my father found better work with Isaac's Industries in Eden City, and now we were moving here from River City. Still, though, all the guns and guards were definitely unsettling. Still, my father tried to reassure me. Hey, it's only to keep the bad people out of the Garden District. We're going to be completely fine, and if anything happens to you, I will protect you. We're innocent, and we have nothing to fear, he said as we pulled closer and closer to the checkpoint. There weren't any cars ahead of us, but still, we had to go through a few different things. First, they had us drive onto a scale where they weighed the car and us inside of it. Then they had Geiger counters that they waved around the car and all of the parts. They were especially careful to check the wheels and the engine specifically. They even popped the hood to check it. But then the officer asked my father for our passports. While my father spoke to the officer, I remained in the back, careful not to look at the Vigiles in the eye. He wore body armor, and I could count no less than 2 guns and 4 knives holstered to his belt. He didn't wear any badge, nor any identifying insignia, not even a name tag, but I do recognize the swagger of the Vigiles. the elite police force of the Emperor. But as they talked, I continued to try to avoid eye contact, and I realized that another officer was staring at me through my window. Even when I avoided his eyes, he still stared me down, and then he whispered to the officer speaking with my father, who changed his tone with my father. "Out of the car," the officer ordered. My father started to unbuckle his seatbelt, but then the officer stuck out his arm, keeping my father's door shut. "Not you, your daughter," the officer said as the other soldier opened the back door and crossed his arms as he backed up. I glanced up at my father, and he only whispered, "Just do what they say. You have nothing to fear." I quietly got out of the car, and the two officers stared me down as another soldier waved a Geiger counter over me, like they were expecting me to be radioactive or to do something wrong in front of them. "Do you have any affiliations with the Mad Scientists Union?" "No," I told them, not making eye contact with them, while the officer tried a different question. "Have you ever been outside of the Empire of the Seven Cities?" he asked, his right hand resting on his pistol, while I shook my head. "No, I never even left River City before today." The officer kept his hand on his pistol while he asked his next question. "Have you worked with any declared enemies of the Emperor or the Empire?" I shook my head. The officer seemed to get more upset by my answer, as he removed his pistol from his holster, and even with it aimed at the ground, I felt my heart race. "Get on your knees and look me in the eye." I hesitated, only to hear my father whisper from the car. "Do what he says," he said, worry creeping into his voice. Things like this weren't supposed to happen to us. The Vigiles were only supposed to seek out bad people. But the way that this officer was looking at me, his eyes held no mercy and only anger towards me, like he couldn't wait to get to rid the world of me. But still, I did as my father said and got on my knees, and I looked up at the officer, completely terrified and at his mercy, while the officer spoke. "Only the guilty don't look an officer of the Emperor in the eye. Now answer this final question." He didn't lift the gun to my head, but in my mind's eye I knew he could do so without question. He could kill me in front of my father, and both him and myself would be powerless to stop the officer. I stared into his eyes, and in that moment, as he asked his final question, I didn't feel fear. I only pitied him. In his eyes, he saw me as someone to mess with, to tell a story to his men later. He was truly a weak man, who was stuck guarding the same gate, never going to advance, and this was the most interesting thing that would happen to him for a long time. Bullying a young girl and her father was the most that he felt alive. He already decided he was going to let me go after this question, and he didn't care what we did. He already was going to tell his superiors that he saw an MSU sticker on my backpack, and that inspired him to pull me out. That was vague enough and enough of a threat that he knew he could get away with it. I didn't know how I knew all this information, but I did. And I was as sure of it as my own thoughts when they finally asked his final question. "Why is someone like you moving into the Garden District?" My father got a job with Isaac's Industries as the new VP of R&D. We are moving for his new job, I said without fear as he studied me. His mood changed. He expected me to still be afraid. But still, he slid his pistol into his holster. "Get back in the car," he ordered as he walked away, and so did his subordinate. I quietly got into the car while someone else waved my father forward, and he quietly drove into the garden district. He remained quiet as he thought about not seeming suspicious. While in the back, I let my heart slow down, and I stared at the amazing streets of the garden district. The trees grew large on the sidewalk, and they were carefully crafted so they were all identical to each other. The businesses all looked even more touristy than the tourist shops in River City. We passed by no less than 3 different cat cafes and 2 dog bakeries as we headed to our new apartment. "Are you okay?" my father asked while I shook my head. "I'll be all right, but I think it might be good if you speak to his boss," I said to him as I stared out through the window and saw other details of Eden City. I saw solar panels built on the top of every business, and lots of businesses had neon just behind their windows. At night, I imagined the garden district lit up like a fireworks show. At this time, though, it was plain with only a few people out, but it felt like the garden district was a lot more people than were in it right now. Still, when we pulled up to the tower, it was very old-fashioned. The tower was almost 100 stories tall, and according to my father, everyone who worked at Isaac's Industries lived there. On the 42nd floor was where we lived. The movers already moved all of our stuff into the apartment, and the only thing left was to move ourselves in. The apartment had 2 stories to it. My father had his personal office and bedroom, and I had my own bedroom that had its own bathroom. And even though everything was moved in it, it didn't feel right. Sure, my closet had all of its clothes in place, my bed was against the wall, but it still didn't feel like home. At least, not yet. I let myself lay on my bed while I processed everything that happened. I was in a brand new place. Tomorrow I would be going to school, and hopefully things would only get better. The next day I started school, and it was definitely awkward being the new girl, especially the month before finals and being introduced in the middle of the week. Every class made me do the same song and dance of showing me off in the beginning. "Tell us your name and something about yourself." My name is Esmeray Sarah Pratchett, and I was born in River City. Naturally, that brought up a few random questions. "What district did you grow up in?" River City isn't organized by districts. It's organized by counties and parishes, but I lived in Autumn County. "Have you ever seen a ghost?" No. At first, these questions were amusing, but by 4th period, they were quite annoying, and it was always the same 3 questions. But my 4th period class was science, with my teacher named Mr. Wonder. He was someone who went out of his way to make his students laugh and tried to make the lesson relatable by creating experiments that would relate to the lesson and have the entire class participate in it. I immediately hated him. As I stared at him doing his lectures and going over the experiment, I could tell he was thinking about how dense we were. I wasn't sure how I could start reading people's thoughts, but after what happened with the Vigiles just outside the garden district, it felt like I could understand people on a deeper level. The rational part of my mind was certain it was just some advanced form of thin slicing, or examining small details and being able to draw accurate conclusions from that information. But an excited part of me kept thinking I was actually reading people's thoughts. So far, the biggest surprise I got from reading people's minds was that most people were really boring. Sure, there was the thrill the first few times in knowing the answer to the teacher's question, but then after a while, it was more interesting to try and read the student's mind to figure out how they got the answer they got. But outside of class, most of the other students just thought about the next class, or how hungry they were, or whatever was right in front of them. But there was an exception to this. The quiet kid in class. I think his name was Philip. He spent most of his time daydreaming scenarios where things could happen around him. He thought about how he would escape the classroom if everyone else turned into zombies. He thought about the first thing he would buy with a million centi, and then he planned it out all the way down to the last coin. And he thought about the best way to introduce magic to the modern world. While the teacher droned on and on about plate tectonics, I was busy listening to Philip's thoughts about how different the world would look if the world still had one supercontinent with all the nations on it. After Mr. Wonder's lesson about plate tectonics, he had his big announcement. The school science fair was occurring in just a month, and naturally, that was the final for science class. A decent score in the science fair guaranteed a passing grade in Mr. Wonder's class. If nothing was submitted for the science fair, then even if you got a perfect score in everything else, then you would just fail his class. A wave of anxiety washed through the room just as Mr. Wonder announced that partners would be allowed in the science fair, but he would be grading both as a group and as individuals. While everyone else rushed off to find partners, I already knew who I wanted. Philip sat at his desk, not even looking up from his notebook. He knew he wasn't popular, and no one would choose to be with him if they could be with their friends. He was definitely surprised when I sat next to him. So, you okay with us being partners for the science fair? Trust me, I know what I am doing. Philip eyed me up and down as he weighed the pros and cons of having me on his team. But after a moment, he decided that even if I didn't do anything, he could pull his weight enough to get a passing score. Sure. Do you have any idea what you want the experiment to be on? He asked. The answer for me was easy. I knew he already had a list of subjects he wanted to test, but he also pared it down to an acceptable list. But at the very top of his dream list fit me perfectly. I was thinking about testing psychic abilities. I told him, as his mind started racing and he smiled for the first time that entire day. The first 2 weeks of the project was spent on writing the hypothesis and doing the background research on telepathic phenomena. The background research was mostly speculative and had a lot of blogs that were written about it, but very little actual research. It felt like I was studying my autism all over again. There were people who claimed to be the relatives or friends of people who had this ability and how it affected them. But the research on those who did have these abilities was a lot scarcer. But after a lot of digging, we found a few examples of actual research. First, we found an MSU article about testing a group of 10 people who claimed to have telepathic abilities. They would have the psychic in a room while the subject, the person they were reading, was in a different room looking at a projector. The projector would project an image with a color, and the psychic would have to say what the symbol was and what the color was. There were 4 colors and 4 symbols, so the odds of a psychic just randomly guessing the symbol correctly was about 6.25%. And they didn't just do one symbol, they did 30. The odds of a psychic guessing all of them correctly? 7.52 times 10 to the power of negative 37. So statistically low, you are more likely to win the lottery 4 times in a row, or get struck by lightning 1,200 times in a row than guessing all of the symbols correctly in even one test. Of the 10 surveyed, 4 of the psychics were able to state the symbol and the color the subject was observing 100% of the time. 5 of the other psychics were able to impressively state the correct color and symbol with a 67% accuracy. The last subject had a relatively low prediction rate of 20%, but still a lot higher than the expected 6.25%, but not quite what the others had managed. The conclusion at the end of the article stated that there may be something to the telepathic phenomena, or there was something else occurring that they weren't able to account for. An impressive piece of research, and one that we could easily replicate for the science fair. One of the driving forces of science was that experiments had to be able to be replicable, even if they had different results. So if we could replicate this test, even if we didn't prove anything, then those results were still usable, as long as the scientific method was followed. There were also a few other articles discussing telepathy as an esoteric phenomena. One such article, written by a private investigator from River City, Philip and I learned that many esoteric creatures that claimed to use telepathy were not truly telepathic, but were able to read body language and facial expressions so well that they were able to predict movements and even thoughts before they occurred. She even did an experiment where a vampire who claimed to be able to predict movements before they occurred via telepathy, but when they hit the masks of mock attackers, and suddenly the vampire had a near impossible time predicting movements. She then took it a step further and had neurodivergent attackers fight against the vampire, and then the vampire went from not being able to predict movements to predicting movements incorrectly. The Red Prince's conclusion from this was that if you were dealing with a telepathic creature, that if you could conceal your face or intentionally project different body language, you could confuse the supposedly psychic creature. Again, useful research for us, so that we were certain that neither facial expressions nor visual cues would be a factor in the experiment. Our final piece of research was in an old article about a doctor testing ESP with flashcards. The doctor would look at the card and the subject would have to guess what the doctor was looking at. The test was replicated nearly 300 times with 300 different subjects chosen at random, and no one ever got above the average. While that piece of research wasn't encouraging, it was peer-reviewed and was essentially the same thing as the MSU experiment, but it was cruder, and it did prove that people did try to prove that telepathy existed, and it was opposing research. Our hypothesis that we wrote was that there were a few people who could reliably read the minds of others, but there was bound to exist an unknown amount. So the experiment would be to take 30 classmates who volunteered, and we would have them act as both the psychic and the subject. The subject would see a computer screen that would randomly select a number from the range of 1 through 16, while the psychic looked away from the computer and guessed the number that the subject was looking at. We would do this 30 times for each of the 30 subjects, and they would both get a chance to be the psychic and the subject. Anyone who got significantly higher than 6% was marked as interesting. Getting volunteers was relatively easy. Most of my classmates were excited to be part of an experiment that was fun and going to prove psychics really existed. In our final result, every subject only got a single percentage. But still, Philip and I were tested as psychics. Philip, ironically, got a higher number than normal. He got around 15%, one of the highest scores we had at the time, and he was quite proud of that. At least until it was my turn to be the psychic. I actually got better at understanding people's thoughts and sub-thoughts with practice. A sub-thought is what I called the emotional tone of a person's thought. I'm sure there is a scientific term for it, but it was like the emotional context of what thought was in. Kind of like a voice tone, but a bit deeper than that. As Philip continued with the experiment, looking at the numbers, and I called him out, I could feel his intrigue turn to horror as I realized I was reading his thoughts like he was a book. He wasn't worried about getting caught for his thoughts. He became worried that he didn't have any control over his thoughts. At the end of the experiment, I became the first and only test subject to have a perfect score, and Philip had about 1,000,000 questions for me. When the day of the science fair came, we had a big trifold poster with our results, experiment, and conclusion. The conclusion was nearly 5 paragraphs long, but amounted to that one subject showed vastly greater abilities than the rest, but a few had higher than average, and it may be worth redoing the experiment with those subjects and even more subjects to see if it could be replicated. My classmates were quite excited to see the work that Philip and I did, but Mr. Wonder didn't smile at our project. While he spent more than a few times talking about how everyone did such a good job with their floppy paper posters and poorly written hypotheses, seriously, one kid's hypothesis started with, "I think." He's 12, not to, he should know better by now, but Mr. Wonder still spent almost 5 minutes praising that kid's experiment. But now Mr. Wonder's face was inscrutable, but his thoughts were anything but. He kept thinking about how we were doing junk pseudoscience, that we probably faked all of our results to make it look better. But even after giving my best, "I want to kill you, but I will make you like me first," smile, while presenting the information, he still wasn't convinced. But I wasn't too concerned. Tomorrow was when we presented our poster to our parents and to the school as a whole. We would be judged then. The next night, though, Philip and I couldn't find our poster. It was removed from where it sat, and we couldn't find it. None of my classmates knew where it was, and when I asked Mr. Wonder, he simply pretended he never saw the poster. "Are you sure you even did a science project?" he asked us, but I could read his thieving little thoughts. He hid it in the supply closet, and luckily for us, he was thinking of the code when I asked him where it was. While the judges came down, poster to poster, I had Philip run to the closet and grab our project. Luckily, we got it back and set up just before the judges came. We gave our presentation and our best smiles to the judges, while my dad and Philip's mom both beamed at us with genuine pride. Mr. Wonder sulked in the back while he tried to figure out how we got our poster back. The judges, on the other hand, were in awe of our clear data, concise research, and copious glitter glue. After the judges moved on, Mr. Wonder approached us both with a smile that even Philip knew was false. While he approached, I whispered to Philip, "Start recording. This is about to get interesting." Just in time for Philip to turn on his phone's voice recorder, while Mr. Wonder whispered to us through clenched teeth, "I have no idea how you brats got your poster back from the supply closet, but I am not going to let the pseudoscience pass my class. As far as I am concerned, you both failed to understand this assignment. You both will be repeating this grade." I could feel Mr. Wonder's anger and Philip's fear, but in that moment I looked up into Mr. Wonder's eyes, and I thought about how pathetic he looked. He was no different from that vigilante who pulled a child from a car and had them kneel on the ground. He was a tiny man who only felt powerful when weaker people kneeled before him. But I was not going to kneel before this pathetic man, nor any other pathetic men. Not anymore. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Wonder. Our poster was out here the entire time, I said in an innocent tone while giving him more rope to hang himself. Don't play stupid with me, you dumb bitch. I locked your poster away this morning. The only way you two delinquents would have known that is if another student got it for you. When I find out who got it, I will get them expelled. Mr. Wonder, why would you ever hide our poster? Because it's a fucking pseudoscience. There's no such thing as telepathy or psychics. I don't care what your test results say. You faked those results, and you will be repeating the grade. No, not repeating it. You'll both get zeros so thoroughly you'll be playing catch-up in remedial classes. I stared at Mr. Wonder in his eyes as I saw my father standing directly behind him, his arms crossed, waiting to be noticed. As he heard the last of what Mr. Wonder said, "Oh, hi, Dad. What did you think of my science fair project?" I asked, just as Mr. Wonder turned around to face my dad, and his demeanor suddenly changed. Suddenly he realized that he didn't have all the power in this dynamic. "Oh, hello, Mr. Pratchett. I was just telling your daughter that she would be playing catch-up in remedial classes next year. Esmeray is a bright and hard-working girl. I don't think remedial classes will be challenging enough for her, but since you felt so strongly about my daughter's education, why don't we discuss it in the principal's office this Monday?" My dad said, his arms crossed and steel in his eye and in his thoughts. He was thinking about all the ways he could professionally ruin Mr. Wonder with a simple meeting, and he was thinking about how he would have a conversation with me to figure out how bad it all really was. "Well, Mr. Pratchett, I'm happy to have a meeting with my students' parents, but I'm afraid it will be down to your word versus mine, and I'm tenured and I haven't done anything wrong," Mr. Wonder said, trying to save face and defend himself. He definitely had something similar happen in the past, likely many times, but he got away with it each time. But fortunately, Philip knew exactly what to say. "Actually, it's your word versus your word," Philip said as he took his phone out and played back part of the recording. "Don't play stupid with me, you dumb bitch," the recording said, and Mr. Wonder paled, and my father turned red and his voice got real quiet. "I think we should speak with the principal now, Mr. Wonder. What do you think?" he asked, his hand squeezing Mr. Wonder's shoulder. Very clear that Mr. Wonder didn't have a choice in this matter. My father led us to the principal, while my father said in his calmest and most rational voice, "Oh, Agamemnon, I wanted to have a discussion with you about my daughter's future with your school. Philip and I won the blue ribbon for the science fair and got perfect scores in science class. Mr. Wonder didn't return that Monday, nor any day after that. My father was proud of me for winning the science fair, but he was most proud of Philip and I for standing up to a bully. We celebrated with diner food, my father, Philip, Philip's mother, and myself. My father always rewarded defending myself with letting me choose dinner for the night.